Have you ever noticed how the royal family seems to drop its most explosive decisions right before Christmas? As if the festive lights somehow make the bombshells look softer, gentler, easier to swallow? Well, what happened this year makes every past December announcement look like a warm-up act. Because ahead of Christmas, in a move so jaw-dropping that insiders themselves reportedly froze in disbelief, King Charles initiated something no monarch has dared touch in generations. The revocation of the Sussex title, by letters patent, at the exact moment divorce whispers surrounding Harry and Meghan reached their loudest pitch. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Why now? Why this? And why, of all moments, did this decision quietly land right as royal insiders say certain legal proceedings finally reached their end? Tonight, we're diving deep into the most dramatic fictionalized interpretation of this unfolding royal saga, a narrative filled with legal maneuvers, emotional fractures, family secrets, centuries-old protocols, and a Christmas countdown ticking so loudly it nearly shakes the walls of Buckingham Palace itself. But before we go further, let me ask you something. What would drive a king to pull the trigger on a decision this historically charged, this politically risky, this emotionally devastating, right before the most symbolic family holiday of the year? And more importantly, what changed? Because something did. Something big. Something that pushed Charles from hesitation to action. Something that forced the palace from silence to preparation. Something that turned a simmering rumble of tension into an irreversible, constitutional-level decision. Now here's the real twist. Those who were in the room, the fictional advisors, the dramatized courtiers, the insiders who watched this unfold, claimed the real drama wasn't the signature. It wasn't the royal seal being pressed into the thick parchment. It wasn't even the words revocation or amendment or letters patent. It was the timing. And timing, in the royal family, is never accidental. But before we unpack the Christmas strategy, the palace pressure, the legal whispers, the emotional fallout, the hidden motivations, and the private conversations that story-wise shaped this moment, we need to rewind. Because to understand the gravity of this decision, even in a dramatized narrative, you have to understand just how monumental it is for a monarch to revoke anything tied to a royal title, especially a ducal one, especially one attached to a son, especially one tied to a family already fractured in the public eye. So let's take it step by step, piece by piece, pulling every dramatic thread, revealing every fictionalized twist, and shining a bright, cinematic spotlight on the moments that supposedly led King Charles to the desk where the documents sat, inked, sealed, and ready to redefine the Sussex identity forever. Let's begin. Imagine the scene. It's early morning in London. The kind of cold winter air that cuts straight through gloves. The palace corridors are unusually quiet, with that eerie, echoing silence that only happens when something big is brewing, something nobody wants to mention out loud. A courier arrives. Not the usual type. Not the one with routine correspondence or ceremonial mail. This one carries a crimson folder. Thick, heavy, important. A folder reserved only for documents that require the sovereign's signature. An immediate constitutional effect. The kind of folder used for motions of state, for constitutional adjustments, for actions that cannot be reversed once the royal seal is pressed down. Inside that folder, at least in our dramatized interpretation, sits a draft that several advisors had been quietly refining for weeks. A draft that would formally adjust the status, expectations, and public definition of the Sussex identity. A draft that, if approved, would become one of the most talked-about letters patent in modern royal history. But here's the twist, and this is where the tension builds. The folder arrives not during a normal parliamentary cycle, not during a calm period, not in the usual season when such documents are reviewed. It arrives now, right before Christmas, right as rumors of a finalized private separation between Harry and Meghan circle international media. Dramatized rumors, of course, for the sake of storytelling, and the palace's threshold for public confusion finally snaps. And that's where everything begins. Because if you look closely at royal decision-making, especially in dramatized narratives, you'll see a pattern. Whenever the monarchy is under pressure, whenever the public mood shifts, whenever internal fractures deepen, the palace doesn't react immediately. No, they wait. They plan. They observe. They monitor. And then, at the moment the timing is most advantageous, or most symbolic, a decision drops. So here's the question. Was this revocation, timed so perfectly before Christmas, a gesture of unity and order? A firm boundary? A political safeguard? Or something far more personal? What if the timing wasn't just strategic? What if it was emotional? Let's open that door. Now consider this. Christmas isn't just any holiday for the royal family. It's the annual reset moment. The gathering where fractures are publicly masked, tensions are tucked under neatly decorated fir trees, and everyone pretends unity is real, even when the cameras switch off. But every year, there's always a story, a whisper, a headline, a shift. This year, though, in our fictional narrative, the stakes were higher. Harry and Meghan were already on their own path, publicly independent, privately strained. Insiders whisper of two separate schedules, two separate households, two separate PR voices speaking in contradictions. And at the center of all this, King Charles, a father caught between two worlds, his duty as sovereign, and his complicated, emotional ties as a parent. Duty won, but the emotional cost? That comes later. Still, even with tension rising, even with family loyalty strained, even with the holiday countdown ticking like a metronome, one thing stands out. The palace didn't simply wait for the dust to settle. They didn't hold off until January. They didn't delay for optics. They moved now. Right now. The timing wasn't accidental. It wasn't convenient. It wasn't routine. It was calculated. Because Christmas, historically and symbolically, is the monarchy's most watched moment. A moment of unity. A moment of reinforcement. A moment of messaging. And this year, they wanted one message very clear. The monarchy is moving forward. With or without the Sussex title. With or without the image of a united royal family. With or without the narrative of togetherness. And when the palace makes a pre-Christmas move this deliberate, it's never just about the present moment. It's about sending a message for the entire year ahead. But what exactly triggered that decision? What was the tipping point? What happened behind closed doors? To understand that, we need to look inside the fictional legal proceedings surrounding the Sussexes. Proceedings that, for months, had quietly been drifting toward a conclusion. Proceedings that palace watchers speculated about. Proceedings that, once completed, removed the last obstacle preventing the title revocation from moving forward. And here's where the story sharpens. As whispers of a formal separation agreement reached the palace, purely dramatized for this narrative, senior officials reportedly realized the monarchy needed clarity, order, stability. The Sussex identity, left undefined, threatened that stability. And so, a decision was made. A firm one, a historic one, a painful one, a necessary one, at least through the lens of dramatized royal storytelling. But the real story isn't just the revocation. It's the ripple effects. What does this mean for Harry's position? What does it mean for Meghan's public identity? What does it mean for the children? What does it mean for the monarchy's future? And perhaps the biggest question of all. If this happened now, ahead of Christmas, what else is coming? Because insiders, again, fictionalized for narrative, hint that the revocation wasn't the final chapter. It was the opening, a beginning, a signal that more decisions, more restructurings, more announcements may follow. And you're not going to believe what those insiders claim comes next. But before we go there, before we tear open the next layer, before we explore the emotional fallout, the political strategy, the family fractures, we have to answer a more immediate question. Why did the palace choose this Christmas to make the move? Because the answer to that question is the key to everything else. And once you understand the strategy behind the timing, the symbolism, the pressure, the internal debates, the rest of this story opens up like a vault. A vault filled with old wounds, new tensions, and royal decisions that echo far louder than the public ever hears. And the next chapter? It exposes the very first crack in the palace foundation that led to the document landing on King Charles's desk in the first place. A crack hidden not in public statements, nor in media appearances, but inside the letters patent themselves. And trust me, what's written inside those documents, in our dramatized narrative, is nothing like what the public expects, because it wasn't simply a revocation. It was something far more complicated, far more calculated, far more explosive. And when you hear what clause was included, you'll understand exactly why the timing matters, and exactly why the decision couldn't wait until after Christmas. Have you ever seen a single sentence change the direction of an entire royal lineage? Because that's exactly what insiders, in this fictionalized reconstruction, claim happened when King Charles opened the crimson folder, skimmed through the lines, and paused on a clause so sharp, so surgically precise, that even his closest advisors reportedly shifted uncomfortably in their seats. And here's the provocative question you need to hold on to as we step into this chapter. What if the revocation wasn't the explosive part? What if the real bombshell was the condition attached to it? Because this clause, this one line embedded deep in the middle of the document, wasn't just about removing the Sussex title. It was about limiting what could be done with it. And more specifically, who could benefit from it. This wasn't just constitutional. This wasn't just symbolic. This was personal. But before we get into the emotional fracture this clause created, let's pull back for a moment. Let's zoom out. Because most people have no idea what a letter patent even is. They've heard the term. They've seen it in headlines. But they don't realize just how heavy, historically, legally, and emotionally, these documents are. So let's set the stage. Imagine this. Thick parchment, calligraphic ink, royal insignia, legal language that reads less like modern English and more like something forged in a medieval chamber. This is not a casual memo. This is not a polite request. This is not a flexible guideline. Letters patent are statements of royal will, declarations of status, blueprints of monarchy structure, signed by the sovereign, sealed, and made permanent. Permanent. That's the key word. When a monarch amends or revokes a title through letters patent, that's not a symbolic gesture. It is a constitutional act. It is binding. It is final. It is the royal equivalent of carving a decision into stone. So when King Charles lifted the document that morning, when he read through the lines written in formal, immovable language, he wasn't just reading about the Sussex title. He was reading about history, about legacy, about lineage, about the future of the monarchy his mother spent 7 decades protecting. And that's where the tension in the room began. Because revoking a title, even within this dramatized story, isn't a small thing. But attaching a clause that restricts its future use? That's unprecedented. And yet there it was, clear as day, written in crisp ink, framed in legal precision, waiting for signature. But here's where things get even more interesting, even more dramatic, even more cinematic. Because according to the insiders in our fictionalized narrative, King Charles didn't react immediately. He didn't slam the document shut. He didn't ask questions. He didn't call for a meeting. He simply stared at that clause, long enough for the room to fall silent. Long enough for the advisors to exchange glances. Long enough for everyone to realize. Something about that line hit him deeply. The question is why? What was in it? What did it imply? What did it protect? What did it prevent? To understand that, we have to rewind the tension even further. We have to step into the months leading up to this moment. Months filled with private discussions, confidential drafts, political calculations, and emotional storms. Because this clause didn't appear out of nowhere. It didn't magically materialize on December's icy doorstep. It was born out of pressure. Pressure on the monarchy. Pressure on the public. Pressure on Charles as a father. Pressure on Charles as a king. And when pressure builds inside the palace, something always cracks. Let me ask you something directly. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between what's right for the world and what's right for your family? Between duty and love? Between responsibility and emotion? Now imagine making that choice not in private, but in front of an entire nation. A nation watching your every move. A nation dissecting every decision. A nation split between sympathy, skepticism, loyalty, frustration. This was the crucible King Charles stood inside. Because regardless of public drama, regardless of media headlines, regardless of political implications, Harry is still his son. And Meghan, despite every strain, was still part of the family story. And the children, innocent, young, unaware, were symbols of continuity. So why attach a clause that would affect all of them? Why now? Why this close to Christmas? Why with such finality? To answer that, we have to walk into a scene that happened weeks before the crimson folder was delivered. A meeting. A quiet one. One that wasn't on royal schedules. One that didn't appear in public diaries. One held between only 3 people. Again, in this dramatized narrative, King Charles, a senior constitutional advisor, and the palace's chief legal strategist. It was there, at that small round table with files stacked like domino bricks, that the real strategy began. Because at first, the palace wasn't pushing for full revocation. They were considering revision, adjustment, reframing. But everything shifted when a new legal interpretation was brought to Charles's attention. One that suggested a potential loophole, a loophole that could, under certain conditions, allow the Sussex title to be revived, repurposed, or used in ways the palace found unacceptable. A loophole that reportedly terrified them. Not because of Harry, not because of the children, but because of branding, because of future possibilities, because of the potential for the Sussex identity to be leveraged in ways the monarchy could not control. And that's where the clause came from. Its purpose was simple: to close the loophole, to lock the door, to ensure finality. But here's the emotional twist. That clause didn't just close the door on the title. It closed the door on a chapter of family identity. It closed the door on reconciliation, at least symbolically. It closed the door on the possibility of restoring the Sussex brand in the future. And for Charles, that door wasn't easy to shut. Now close your eyes for a second and picture the weight of that moment. The king sitting in silence. The document open before him. His advisors waiting. The winter light pouring through the palace windows. The ticking of an antique clock echoing in the room. A king, a father, a decision. Now here's where things get even more intense, even more dramatic, even more revealing. Because the moment Charles reached for the pen, again, in our dramatized account, one advisor reportedly leaned forward and quietly asked, "Your Majesty, are you certain you wish to proceed with the clause as written?" A loaded question, a dangerous question, a question that sliced straight to the heart of the matter. Because the clause wasn't just constitutional. It was emotional, and Charles knew that. He knew the consequences. He knew what this meant for public perception, family dynamics, and future history books. And still, he nodded, slowly, deliberately, with a weight only a monarch can understand. He didn't speak. He didn't explain. He didn't justify. He just nodded. And that was the moment the advisors moved. One slid the document forward. Another placed the pen on top. A third stepped back. This was it. History in motion. Legacy shifting. A new chapter beginning. But the moment Charles raised the pen, something unexpected happened. Something the advisors didn't see coming. Something that took the room from tense to electric. The king paused. Not because he changed his mind. Not because he hesitated. Not because he doubted. But because he remembered something. Something private. Something painful. Something connected to Harry. Long before the title, long before the drama, long before the rift. A memory. A conversation. A promise. And as that memory surfaced, the king's eyes reportedly softened, just for a moment, before he steeled himself again. Because there was no turning back now. Duty demanded action. Stability demanded clarity. History demanded a signature. He lowered the pen, pressed it to the parchment, and that's when it happened. Not the signature, not the stamping, not the formal declaration, but the reveal of the clause, the line that changed everything. And this is where I need you to pay attention, because this line sets the stage for everything that follows in this story. It was buried halfway down, worded in formal legal phrasing, easy to miss unless you knew what to look for. But Charles saw it. Everyone saw it. And the moment the ink touched the page, that clause, that single sentence, went from draft to reality. And here it is, the cliffhanger that pushes us into the next chapter. The clause didn't just block future use of the Sussex title. It tied the decision directly, explicitly, to the finalization of marital proceedings. Which means, the revocation wasn't simply about monarchy. It was connected to something deeper, something personal, something irreversible, something the palace never intended the public to know. The clause tied the revocation to the finalization of marital proceedings. Did you catch that? Not to conduct, not to public behavior, not to constitutional necessity, not even to royal protocol violations. Marital proceedings, which immediately raises the question, why would a monarch, in a document meant to address a ducal title, reference the private legal status of a couple? Ask yourself this. When in royal history has a letter patent ever tied itself to the outcome of a marriage? This wasn't normal. This wasn't typical. This wasn't precedent. This was targeted, surgical, intentional. So now we have to ask the question that was whispered behind palace doors. Was the title revocation conditional, or was it responsive? Meaning, was it something the palace was planning only if the divorce concluded, or something they waited to finalize until the divorce did? Because those are two very different strategies. One is reactive, the other is premeditated. One is about optics, the other is about control. One is about avoiding scandal, the other is about preventing future complications. And here's the twist. The clause wasn't written in a way that suggested the palace was still deciding. It suggested the palace had already been informed. The wording implied knowledge, certainty, completion, a done deal. Which means, in this dramatized narrative, the question wasn't, are they divorcing? The question was, when did the palace know? And why did they wait until now to act? Let that sink in. Because if the clause was structured after the palace had confirmation, even informally, then that means the revocation wasn't just a royal decision. It was a reaction, a response, a final step to close a chapter that was already ending privately. And here's where things get even more fascinating. Because according to insiders in this dramatized account, the legal strategists were split on whether to include that clause at all. Some argued it was unnecessary. Some argued it was inflammatory. Some argued it would raise too many questions. But one senior advisor reportedly insisted. And their reasoning is where the story becomes razor-sharp. The monarchy must protect itself not only from present events, they allegedly said, but from future ambiguity. Future ambiguity. That's the key. What ambiguity were they talking about? Let's break it down. If Harry and Meghan were separating, even quietly, then the Sussex brand was effectively splitting in two. And the palace, after years of unpredictable headlines, leaks, interviews, and contradictory narratives, was terrified of a scenario where one side used the title to build a platform. The other side disavowed it. The children's rights and identities became disputed. The monarchy was blamed for inconsistency. The public narrative spun out of control. Think about it. A split Sussex brand could create chaos. Political chaos. Media chaos. Symbolic chaos. It could lead to questions about inheritance. Questions about representation. Questions about future royal obligations. Questions about whether the children should inherit anything at all. And the palace hates questions it cannot answer. So the clause, in this fictional interpretation, served one purpose. To make sure there would be no gray area, no loopholes, no disputes, no future claims, no public battles, no branding wars. Clean cut, clear break. Final decision. But here's where things get even more emotional. Because the minute Charles signed that clause, he wasn't just signing a legal safeguard. He was signing away the possibility of restoration. He was signing away the Sussex title's presence in the next generation. He was signing away the possibility of reconciliation expressed through status. And yes, he was signing away part of his own son's royal identity. This is where the contradiction hits hardest. A king making a decision to protect the monarchy, even though that decision would inevitably wound his child. Duty versus love, crown versus blood, stability versus sentiment. It's the eternal royal conflict. And in this dramatized moment, Charles chose duty. But the emotional fallout? That would come later. Because here comes the surprising twist. The moment the king signed the clause, the exact moment the ink soaked into parchment, something else happened. Somewhere across the Atlantic, in the California morning light, a separate document was being reviewed. A document connected to the fictional marital proceedings. A document that, for the first time, laid out a path forward for two people who had built a brand, a reputation, and a global presence as a team, to now stand independently. And the palace knew this. Not because of leaks, not because of press rumors, but because something had been quietly communicated. Not publicly, not formally, but enough for the palace to act with certainty. Which raises an even more unsettling question. Did the palace wait for divorce confirmation to revoke the title? Or did the divorce finalize because the palace was preparing to revoke the title? Cause and effect. Effect and cause. Which one is it? The truth, in this fictional narrative, is uncomfortable. It was both. The palace waited for the right moment. But the right moment was created by the very circumstances they had been anticipating for months. It was a dance. A delicate, political, emotional dance. A dance between institution and individuals. Between power and autonomy. between stability and freedom. And the signature was the final step. But here's the detail almost everyone misses. The clause didn't just tie the revocation to marital proceedings. It tied it to the conclusion of them. Meaning, the palace didn't move until the final stage, until the last signature, until the paperwork was done, until there was no going back, which implies something massive. The palace was watching. They knew when it happened. They knew when it ended. They knew the moment the marriage, as a legal entity, reached its conclusion. That is why the clause was timed precisely. That is why the announcement was positioned before Christmas. That is why the decision hit like a shockwave. Because the palace wanted the message to be clear. One chapter ended. Another chapter begins. And the monarchy is resetting before the year is over. But we still haven't answered the most explosive question of all. What exactly was the clause? What did it say? What did it prevent? What did it allow? And why was it so controversial inside palace walls? Because the clause didn't just close a loophole. It opened a door to something far more dramatic, far more emotional, far more revealing. A door that connects the title revocation to the children, to the succession, to the public narrative, and, shockingly, to one royal figure who has remained silent this entire time. And when you realize who quietly influenced that clause, you'll see the entire situation in a completely new light. The clause wasn't simply a legal line. It was the heartbeat of the entire document, the quiet engine driving the revocation, the one element that made even the most seasoned palace advisors stiffen in their chairs because they knew what it meant. It meant this wasn't about public scandal or media pressure or even institutional preservation. It meant this was timed. It was coordinated. It was deeply, intimately linked to a moment that happened far from Buckingham Palace. Far from the cameras, far from the crowds, far from the gilded world of royal power. It meant Charles didn't just sign a constitutional document. He signed a response to a personal ending. And therein lies the contradiction. A monarch acting in the name of duty, but triggered by the quiet echo of something undeniably human. Think about that for a moment. A king, bound to centuries-old tradition, reacting not to headlines, but to the conclusion of a marriage. One that had been, for years, both a global fascination and a private ache. What does it say when the palace decides that the moment a private union dissolves, the moment two people step on as separate paths, that is the exact moment a title must also die? And here's where things tighten even further. That clause ensured that the title could not remain in limbo, could not be claimed by one side or the other, could not be used as a tool in branding, negotiations, or custody arrangements. It shut every door before anyone could even reach for the handle. It meant the monarchy wanted no room for interpretation, no space for public tug-of-war, no future in which the Sussex identity floated between two worlds. This wasn't just legal clarity. This was strategic closure. Total, final, irreversible. But the real shock isn't the clause itself. It's who pushed for it. Not the king, not the legal strategist, not the political advisors. No. According to this dramatized account, the person who insisted on the clause, the one who argued for its inclusion with a conviction that startled everyone, was someone who has mastered silence as power. Someone who rarely speaks publicly, but whose influence inside the palace has always been underestimated. Someone who has been called the monarchy's steel backbone. Princess Anne, the quiet force, the uncompromising traditionalist. The woman who, unlike nearly everyone else in the royal orbit, has never wavered in her belief that duty must outweigh emotion, always. And when she reviewed the early drafts of the document, she immediately spotted the loophole. She flagged it. She questioned it. She pressed the legal team. And then she reportedly made her position crystal clear. If the Sussex title was going to be revoked, it must be revoked cleanly, permanently, without any chance of future disputes. Anne's reasoning was simple and brutally logical. The monarchy cannot afford ambiguity. Not now. Not with public trust fragile. Not with international reputation fluctuating. Not with Harry and Meghan representing an unpredictable variable. The title could not remain tethered to an unresolved marriage. It had to be severed from the moment that marriage legally ended. And that is why the clause existed. Because Anne insisted it. And Charles agreed. But what does that reveal about the emotional landscape inside the palace leading up to this moment? It suggests that while Charles hesitated, out of paternal conflict, out of empathy, out of sorrow, and did not. She saw the institution. He felt the family. She saw the risk. He felt the loss. She sought the future. He mourned the past. And when those two forces collided, the clause was born. A clause written not in anger, but in resolve. A clause that carried the weight of both steel and sorrow. A clause that made clear, once the Sussex marriage legally ended, the Sussex title must end with it. Now imagine being in that room, the one where the final draft was presented, the heavy parchment on the table, Charles staring at the line that changed everything, and standing firm in her conviction, advisors waiting in uneasy silence. The king caught between two worlds, the world of legacy and the world of blood. And then, just as he lifts the pen, a memory, a private, painful one, surfaces. A memory that slows him, just for a heartbeat. A moment between father and son. A moment that belonged to a time before titles, before fame, before interviews, before fractures. A moment from years ago that now stings with new meaning. And yet, despite that emotional turbulence, Charles lowers the pen, signs, seals, and with that act, he sets off a shockwave bigger than anyone anticipated. Because the clause had another consequence, one even more explosive than its tie to divorce. The clause didn't just end the Sussex title. It dictated what could happen to any future claims to it. Meaning, it wasn't just a revocation. It was an erasure. Not erasure of history, but erasure of possibility. A door permanently closed to the future. But there was something else hidden beneath the surface, something that only a few in the room realized at the time. The clause also affected the children in ways no one expected. Not directly, not explicitly, but structurally. Because once the title was severed from marital proceedings, it automatically affected inherited claims, style, usage, and any formal references connected to the Sussex lineage. And that's when one advisor reportedly whispered, "This changes everything." Because it did, and it would, and it was only the beginning. But here's the part that elevates this moment from dramatic to seismic. The clause was timed to activate only after the legal dissolution of the marriage. Meaning, someone had to notify the palace the moment the marital proceedings concluded. Someone had to deliver the message. Someone had to confirm with certainty. And when that confirmation arrived, quietly, discreetly, unofficially, the palace moved. Immediately. Which means someone close to Harry or Meghan, or connected to their legal team, communicated something the public did not know yet. A private chain linking two worlds, the American proceedings and the British monarchy. And the palace acted on that private knowledge with absolute precision. Now here's the question no one wants to ask, but you need to ask it. Who told them? Because that detail alone could unleash an entirely different layer of conflict. One that could ignite both sides of the ocean. One that could fuel speculation for years. One that reveals just how deeply entangled these two worlds still are. But before we go there, before we unravel who delivered that message, before we expose why the clause had to be locked into place right before Christmas, we need to address the most pressing twist of all, that the moment Charles signed the clause, he didn't just change the legal status of a title, he changed the emotional architecture of his family. Because once the ink dried, once the seal was pressed, once the final draft was filed, the king didn't speak. He didn't celebrate. He didn't even breathe deeply. Those who were present say he simply closed the folder, rested his hand on top of it, and whispered something so quiet no one could make out the words. But they knew what it meant. This wasn't triumph. It wasn't victory. It wasn't vindication. It was grief. Grief wrapped in duty. Grief wrapped in responsibility. Grief wrapped in the cold reality that sometimes the role of a monarch demands decisions the heart would never choose. And that brings us to the final twist of this chapter, the one that will carry us directly into chapter 2. Because while the world will focus on the revocation, while headlines will circle the title, while pundits will debate the symbolism, the real story, the one the palace least wanted to surface, is the content of the second document, the one that arrived minutes after the first. The one that contained a clause even more shocking, even more personal, even more dangerous to reveal. And that document is the one that truly changed everything, and no one outside that room has ever heard what was written inside. There are moments in royal history, fictionalized or otherwise, where the air in a room changes before anyone speaks. where something arrives, something material, yet wrapped in mystery, and the atmosphere tightens like a drum. That is exactly what happened when the footman, unusually pale, stepped back into the king's private study holding a second crimson folder. Not navy, not black, crimson, identical to the first, as if the palace itself wanted to signal, this one matters too. The advisors exchanged looks that were half curiosity and half dread, because they knew the procedural rules. You do not deliver 2 letters patent folders in a single session unless something monumental has been coordinated behind the scenes. One document changes a title, the other changes a legacy, and Charles, still motionless, still processing the weight of what he'd just signed, looked at the second folder with a subtle flicker in his eyes. Not shock, not fear, something quieter. Recognition, as if he'd known this second document was coming, as if he'd been waiting for it, as if the timing had been orchestrated with a precision that left no room for improvisation. The advisors leaned forward, their bodies angled toward the desk, their breaths held in restrained anticipation. Because they knew what a second crimson folder meant. It meant this situation was not merely a matter of revocation. It meant there was a structural addition, a correction, an amendment, or a clarification that needed to accompany the first document. Almost like a shadow document, a hidden twin, a silent partner. But here's the twist that made the room shift from tense to electric. The second document wasn't simply an addendum. It wasn't a mild elaboration or a bureaucratic cleanup. It carried a seal the palace almost never uses, one reserved only for matters involving the direct future of the crown. The succession advisory seal. For a moment, no one moved. Even Anne, who had remained steady and unshakable during the entire signing of the first document, stiffened. The succession seal meant that whatever was inside the second folder wasn't just about Harry. It wasn't just about Meghan. It wasn't even just about the Sussex title. It touched the line of succession. And when you touch succession, you aren't adjusting a title. You are adjusting the kingdom's future. Imagine the weight of that. Imagine being in that room. Imagine knowing that the next few sentences could alter the architecture of the monarchy not just for this generation, but for the next 3. Charles reached for the folder but didn't open it right away. His hand rested on top of it, as if feeling the energy of the decision waiting inside. And that silence, that long, suspended breath, was the loudest moment of the entire day, because everyone in that room knew something. A second succession seal document meant the palace had made a calculation about the consequences of revoking the Sussex title. It meant there was a risk, or a complication, or a future scenario they needed to preempt, and the king was about to confront it. When Charles finally opened the folder, the advisors subtly leaned in, trying to read even the smallest flicker of emotion on his face. People often forget that in these dramatized interpretations, the monarchy functions like a chessboard. Every move is evaluated 12 steps ahead. If revoking the Sussex title was the first move, then this second document was clearly the counter-move, addressing a weakness revealed by the first. Charles's expression didn't change at first. His eyes scanned the page slowly, methodically. But then, midway down, something shifted. His jaw tightened. Not in anger, not in shock, in acceptance. As though the words he read were not surprising, but inevitable. A price he had known he would someday be forced to pay. And now the advisors saw something on his face they rarely saw. Regret. A deep, quiet, ancient regret that came not from the institution, but from the man. Here's the twist. This document wasn't about removing a title. It was about restricting future entitlement. Specifically, entitlement to styles, rights, and recognitions connected to offspring. The clause inside the second document did something unprecedented. It clarified that children born from a title no longer recognized by the crown could not automatically inherit or exercise related styles or privileges. This was enormous. Not because it changed the current line of succession, not at all, but because it prevented potential future claims. It ensured that once the Sussex identity was dissolved, it could not be revived through lineage. In short, the monarchy closed the door not only on Harry and Meghan, but on any future attempt, decades from now, to reattach their children to the Sussex lineage for royal positioning or global branding. This was not punitive. It was preventative. But the emotional shockwave? That was unavoidable. Now imagine Charles, grandfather, monarch, protector of tradition, reading a line that directly affected his grandchildren. Not to remove their titles, not to strip their rights, but to create a boundary around a future the palace feared could spiral into confusion or conflict. The clause made one thing clear. The monarchy was severing the Sussex identity at the root. Clean, absolute, final. And suddenly, everything made sense. The timing, the secrecy, the precision. This wasn't a move against Harry or Meghan. This was a move to protect the throne from future instability. The advisors knew it. Charles knew it, and had pushed for it. And when the full meaning settled in, a heaviness wrapped the room. But here is where the contradiction hits like a hammer. While the monarchy acted out of structural prudence, the emotional fallout would land squarely on the shoulders of a father who had just signed away the last symbolic tie between his son's marriage and his son's royal identity. And now, with this second clause, he was being asked to sign a boundary that touched his grandchildren, not in punishment, but in perimeter. The palace does not gamble with succession. It does not leave open doors for speculation. It does not allow future lawyers or PR teams to reinterpret status decades later. But Charles had to carry both the political and the paternal burden of that decision. And that is why, according to insiders in this dramatized account, the room felt colder as he reviewed the second document than it had during the first. Then came the question. The same question repeated across centuries whenever a monarch is asked to sign a document that affects the next generation. Is this truly necessary? The chief legal strategist nodded, not with confidence, but with resignation. Your Majesty, he said in a quiet voice, if you do not sign this now, you leave uncertainty for future reigns. Uncertainty becomes conflict, and conflict becomes instability. Charles inhaled slowly, heavily, because he knew that was true. And he also knew something else. If he didn't sign it, the next monarch, William, would have to deal with it. And that is a burden Charles would not place on his eldest son, not after everything William had already endured. So with a slow, steady breath, Charles lifted the pen. But the moment he touched the parchment, an advisor noticed something. A single sentence in the middle of the document had been underlined. Not by the legal team, not by the clerks, by Anne. She had quietly marked the section she believed was most vital. And when Charles saw the underlined line, a flicker of pain crossed his face. Because the sentence she marked was the one that clarified that all future claims, uses, or associations with the Sussex identity, by anyone, were permanently dissolved. Not just titles, not just styles, all associations. Forever. It was total, absolute, unyielding. And Charles knew this was the line that would be remembered. He signed the second document. But before anyone could breathe, before the advisors could collect the papers, before and could speak, a message arrived. A message that hadn't been expected until hours later. A message that would flip the emotional temperature of the room. A message from California. And it wasn't from Meghan. And it wasn't from Harry. It was from someone else entirely. Someone whose involvement no one anticipated. Someone whose connection to the proceedings raised more questions than answers. And when Charles read the message, his face changed, not with shock, not with anger, but with something more haunting. Recognition. Because whatever was written, there was something only he would understand. And that message contained the first clue to the real reason behind the revocation. The message that arrived from California was short, shockingly short, but it carried the weight of a confession, a confirmation, and a warning all at once. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even personal in tone. It was clinical, direct, final. And the moment Charles's eyes scanned the line, the advisors knew instantly, instinctively, that this was not a message meant for their ears. It was meant for the king alone. Something that connected years of tension, years of speculation, years of interviews, tears, distance, and silence. It was the kind of message that reaches a parent not as a statement, but as a turning point. And the moment Charles lowered the paper with a faint tremor in his fingers, it became painfully clear. This wasn't just a political decision anymore. This wasn't just constitutional housekeeping. This wasn't even about titles. This was about truth, private, quiet truth that had been buried beneath public narratives for far too long. And now, finally, it surfaced. The advisors waited for Charles to speak, but he didn't. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply stared ahead with the heavy stillness of a man who has just recognized the final puzzle piece he had been trying to avoid. And then, ever so slowly, he placed the message down on the desk and pressed his fingertips to his temple, an old gesture of exhaustion he rarely revealed in public. That's when Princess Anne leaned forward, her voice low, controlled, precise. "Is it confirmed?" There was no judgment in her tone, no shock, no bitterness, only inevitability. She had seen it coming. She had felt the unraveling long before this moment. And when Charles nodded, just once, the room exhaled in a collective, somber understanding. Because the message didn't simply confirm the end of Harry and Meghan's marriage in this dramatized narrative. It revealed what triggered it. The truth was this: the divorce proceedings hadn't been abrupt. They hadn't been impulsive. They hadn't been triggered by a single explosive event. They had been a slow, quiet unraveling that began years earlier. Long before the public sensed the cracks, long before the interviews, long before the Netflix specials, long before the whispers of separate lives. According to the dramatized insiders, the marriage had been struggling privately for far longer than anyone outside their inner circle realized. Not because of distance, not because of fame, not because of pressure, but because of something much more fundamental. The two of them wanted entirely different futures. And the gap between those futures grew wider with each passing year. Harry, despite everything, felt a latent pull toward restoration, even if he didn't admit it publicly. Not restoration of titles or privileges, but restoration of identity. He missed something he couldn't define, something tied not to monarchy, but to belonging. He didn't necessarily want to return, but he didn't want to sever his ties completely either. Meghan, on the other hand, wanted freedom. Total freedom, complete autonomy, the ability to shape a new legacy unshadowed by an institution she viewed as inherently limiting. And over time, the friction between preserve some ties and cut all ties permanently became impossible to ignore. That difference, subtle at first, became the quiet fault line running beneath their marriage. And when that fault line finally ruptured, it did so privately, quietly, and without spectacle. The message from California confirmed that the final stage of the proceedings had been completed. But more importantly, it confirmed who initiated it. And that revelation changed everything. Because in this fictional narrative, it wasn't Harry. It wasn't a mutual decision. It was Meghan. Her legal team had already prepared the documents months earlier. And while Harry didn't oppose it, he didn't accelerate it either. He lingered. He hesitated. He stalled. Not because he wanted to salvage the marriage, but because he feared what it would mean for his children, what separation from a family built on public narratives of unity would do to their identities. But Meghan, having already mapped out her life's next chapter, moved forward decisively. And when the confirmation reached the palace, Charles understood instantly why the title had to be severed now, not later. Because once the marriage dissolved, leaving the Sussex title intact would not only invite confusion, it would invite conflict. But the most haunting detail wasn't who filed. It was the reason listed in the private filings, the one that would never be publicly disclosed, but which the palace was quietly informed of. Irreconcilable futures, not irreconcilable differences, not irreparable trust, irreconcilable futures. Two people standing on opposite ends of the map, each pointing toward a direction the other could no longer follow. And when Charles read that phrase, everything crystallized, because it echoed something he had lived himself decades earlier, something that had shaped his own life, his own regrets, his own painful decisions. The parallel was impossible to ignore, the irony even sharper, and that is why the weight of the message hit him the way it did. Because the words were not just legal terminology, they were a mirror. And here's where things grow even more tangled. According to the dramatized insiders, the divorce filings contained a clause, one Meghan's legal team added at the last minute, concerning titles, legacy structures, and future branding independence. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't vindictive. It was strategic. Meghan wanted autonomy over her future work, future name usage, and future ventures without restrictions tied to a royal identity she no longer wished to carry or be associated with. And that detail sent a shockwave through the palace. Because if Meghan wanted complete separation from royal titles, yet remained legally tied to one, it opened the door for disputes, interpretations, complications. And for the monarchy, that was a nightmare scenario. Which brings us to the central revelation of this chapter. The palace didn't revoke the Sussex title because the marriage ended. The palace revoked the Sussex title because the ending of the marriage exposed a legal gap neither side could afford. A gap that would create years of conflict, disputes, arguments, branding wars, and succession ambiguity. A gap that would force the monarchy to battle narratives publicly, something it refuses to do. A gap that would give both sides the legal grounds to claim something the crown believed must not be claimed by either, control of Sussex. And that is why, when the second document arrived, and the king saw how the divorce filings had been structured, everything locked into place. The monarchy wasn't eliminating the Sussex identity to punish. It was eliminating it to prevent. Prevent confusion. Prevent dispute. Prevent damage. Prevent future legal entanglements that could drag the monarchy into lawsuits, negotiations, retractions, clarifications, and media storms. But the emotional impact on Charles was undeniable, because the message from California wasn't just a confirmation of legal finality. It was the last breadcrumb in a trail that led back to a promise Harry once made, a promise that now felt shattered. Years earlier, in a conversation shared only between father and son, Harry had promised that no matter what happened, they would remain a unit, even if distant, even if independent, even if geographically divided. A unit. And the divorce filings revealed a different reality. A reality in which Harry was no longer part of a unit. He was alone, untethered, caught between two worlds. A world he left, and a world dissolving beneath his feet. And that is what broke Charles the most. Not the title, not the revocation, not the constitutional consequence, but the quiet sadness of knowing his son was now standing at the edge of a life he never fully prepared for. At the edge of a future without a partner, without a title, without a clear identity, not a royal, not fully removed, not fully secure, not fully anything. And that is why his hand trembled. But the story doesn't stop here. Because tucked inside the divorce filings, deep within the private documents, was a detail that would soon become the biggest shockwave of all. A detail so unexpected, so destabilizing, so emotionally explosive that it would force the palace to take emergency action. And it's a detail the public has never heard. A detail that affects not just Harry, not just Meghan, not just Charles, but the children. The detail buried deep inside the private divorce filings was the kind of revelation that buckles the air out of a room, because it didn't concern public expectations or royal image or PR positioning. No, it touched the most sensitive, guarded, vulnerable corner of this entire saga, the future identity of Harry and Meghan's children, and more specifically, the question of how they should be recognized once their parents' marriage legally dissolved. In this dramatized interpretation, when palace advisors reviewed the confidential filings, those that were never meant to see the light of day, they discovered a line so unexpected that even the most seasoned among them froze. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about custody. It wasn't about property or public appearances or shared projects. It was about legacy, about titles, about the question of whether Archie and Lilibet should retain, inherit, or identify with any titles connected to an institution one parent no longer wished to be associated with. Meghan's legal team, anticipating future complexities, had included language suggesting that the children should not be obligated to use or carry titles if doing so conflicted with their upbringing, their environment, or their well-being. On paper, the phrasing looked protective, almost neutral. But to the monarchy, an institution built on lineage, clarity, and continuity, it was a potential constitutional earthquake. Because if one parent asserted that the children need not carry titles, and the palace had no counter-clarification, then in the future, either parent could legally argue for the opposite. One could claim the children deserved full recognition as royal descendants, demanding protections and acknowledgments. The other could argue the children should not be bound by any royal structure whatsoever. And in that gap, between those two possible claims, the monarchy foresaw a nightmare scenario, a future legal battle, a drawn-out dispute, a tug-of-war over the identity of royal grandchildren. And in that moment, the advisors understood something with chilling clarity. The Sussex title wasn't the only thing that needed immediate clarification. The children's standing, symbolic and structural, needed it too. The revelation hit Charles like a blow he had been dreading, because even though the palace had extended the prince and princess titles to the children previously in a gesture that was both compassionate and stabilizing, the divorce filings threatened to make those titles unstable, not through removal, but through ambiguity. If a child carries a title only optionally, or circumstantially, or conditionally, then that title becomes a battleground. And battlegrounds, when it comes to royal identity, become headlines, controversies, legal disputes, and generational wounds. The filing didn't explicitly request removal of the children's titles, it was more subtle. But subtle can be far more dangerous than explicit, because subtlety leaves room for interpretation. And interpretation is exactly what the palace feared. A future in which the children might later reclaim titles, reject titles, selectively use titles, or have others use titles on their behalf for commercial, political, or symbolic leverage. Imagine it, a world decades from now where an adult Archie or Lilibet, shaped by their own personal histories and independent choices, may choose to wield or reject royal identity in ways that could clash with palace expectations or destabilize public perception. The monarchy does not deal in variables. It deals in certainties. And these filings, quiet and legalistic as they were, introduced variables the palace could not ignore. But there was another layer, deeper still, one that Charles understood immediately, instinctively, painfully. The children were innocent. They had no say in the separation, the narratives, the public scrutiny, the interviews, the documentaries, or the pressures placed on their parents. They were simply being carried by the currents of adult decisions. And so the palace, in its dramatized portrayal, recognized that protecting the children wasn't simply a procedural necessity, it was a moral one. The monarchy had a duty to shield them from a future where their identities became ping-pong balls in media cycles or exploited symbols in brand negotiations or emotional leverage in parental disagreements. And the only way to secure that protection was to clarify, immediately and permanently, the structural rules surrounding the titles they had inherited. That is why the advisors, after reviewing the filings, realized the gravity of the moment and quietly informed Charles, "Your Majesty, if the Sussex title is not addressed now, the children will be left in a state of undefined identity, and that will create turmoil on both sides of the Atlantic." And Charles knew they were right. Because the one fear he carried above all else was that his grandchildren, already growing up under intense attention, might someday become pawns in a larger struggle between institution and independence. This brought the king to a crossroads far more delicate than anything he had faced with his sons or daughter-in-law. Removing a title from Harry and Meghan was one thing, but making a decision that indirectly affected the legacy structure surrounding the children? That was another burden entirely. It required precision, sensitivity, and absolute finality. That's when one advisor, voice trembling with the tension of the moment, said, "We cannot allow a future in which these children are caught between competing claims of royal identity." And that statement, simple but piercing, forced Charles to confront a truth he had been avoiding. If he did nothing, the children would grow up with dual realities. American children in daily life, royal grandchildren on paper. And once they reached adulthood, that duality could splinter into 1,000 directions, none of them predictable, all of them potentially destabilizing for the institution he was sworn to protect. But beyond all the constitutional logic and political foresight, another truth weighed heavily on the king: the emotional toll this would eventually have on Harry. Because for all their conflict, all their distance, all their disagreements, Harry loved his children with a fierce, unwavering devotion. And Charles knew that any decision touching their identity, even indirectly, would cut Harry deeply. But the palace also knew something else. Something revealed quietly through communications Harry had made to the institution in the past. Harry did not want his children used as leverage in any conflict. He did not want them trapped in a space where titles defined them or harmed them. His stance was complicated, conflicted even, but clear enough that the palace believed this structural clarification was not an attack on Harry's children. It was a shield. And so the palace moved with both urgency and caution. The decision would not remove the children's existing titles. They remained prince and princess. It would not alter the line of succession. It would not strip rights. Instead, it did something far more calculated. It ensured that the Sussex title, the identity that tied the children to a ducal narrative built by their parents, would not float ambiguously above them. Once the title was dissolved, it could not be reclaimed, reassigned, revived, or referenced for future entitlement. It meant their individual identities could grow freely, without being tethered to a marital title that no longer existed. And though the children would remain royal by blood, the palace ensured that the Sussex identity they inherited symbolically would not become a source of confusion later in life. Yet not everyone in the palace agreed. Some advisors argued that revoking the Sussex title before Christmas would create unnecessary drama, fueling a media frenzy that could overshadow the holiday and further fracture the family. Others argued that the timing was perfect because the public, softened by the season, might accept the decision with less outrage. And, steady and unwavering, made her position clear. We must protect the children from future ambiguity. Anything else is negligence. Her words, firm but calm, cut through the noise. And Charles, sitting in the eye of the storm, knew she was right. But knowing didn't make it easier. The palace understood they had a narrow window. A window created by the divorce filings. A window before public announcement. A window before speculation spun out of control. They had to move now, decisively.